Hi, I'm Chelsea.
And I'm Sophie, and we are here to help guide you to the why behind your wellness why.
Come join us on our journey.
Good morning, Chelsea.
Good morning, Sophie.
So, as we mentioned at the end of our last podcast, we're going to dive into some strength training 101. And today we're going to get into a lot of, gym terminology.
We were talking about this before we started recording this podcast. And at first we were like, I feel like this might be really boring for listeners. But then the more we had talked about it, it's really knowing that terminology first, because if you're doing something without knowing what it means or why, it's just like we talk about with food so much. We talk about carbs and protein and all these different terminology terms, whatever the right word is, all these different terms of food. And we were talking about it before, how with food, it's like a little bit easier to understand or see the word because like they might be on food labels, or if you're logging your food, or see things on social media. But with working out, a lot of these terms are thrown around. So we hear them verbally, but we don't ever really talk about the definitions or what they mean. So we're going to take it back to 101, strength training 101. Sophie is going to give us some great information on these basic terms so you understand what the term means before we dive a little bit deeper into applying them actually in the gym.
Yes, I love it. So let's just start with, the main things you would see if you were going to work out, like sets, reps, etc. So, like, I'm going to do my first set of my program or workout is how many times you would repeat those exercises. But with that, like a set can be a superset, which is a pairing of 2 exercises, or like a tri-set, which is 3, or you can just call it, with most of my clients, I just call it a circuit. I'm like, okay, our first circuit or set of exercises is these 3 things. And that's how many times, like we're going to do 3 to 4 sets of these exercises.
Can you give an example of that just so we can, I know we're going to talk about this more like in the next podcast.
Yeah.
You don't have to get into like the nitty gritty, but just like an example of what you just said.
Yes. So I, with most of my clients, like to do lower body, upper body, core. So this morning with my client, Maddie, our first set of exercises was Bulgarians, chin up holds, and side planks. And we did each exercise 4 times in that set. And then within that set, she did the Bulgarians for 8 reps, the chin up holds for 15 seconds, and 12 reps of this side plank. We did the side plank with something added in. And within that set of 3 exercises, which can also be called a tri-set, I don't let my clients rest until they're done with the set. So again, she did the set 4 times, then she had reps of each exercise within that set, and then rested at the end.
That's super helpful. So a set is kind of like the big circle. And then if you could visually see us, we're like using our hands. And then like inside of that is the reps, which is how many times you're doing that one movement. And then of course, resting is like you had mentioned for your clients, what you usually do with the amount of time you rest either in between that movement or sets.
Yes. Which typically I don't let like my clients do Bulgarians and then rest and then go do chin up holds and then rest. I'm sure there's a time and a place, but I don't have my clients do that. And
I love it.
And then within these sets and reps, there is TUT, some people say, time under tension. So, which can go very well with reps. So, say someone is doing 8 reps. So, you can time that and it'll be, say, 30 seconds, which is the time under tension for Bulgarians. But you can do Bulgarians very fast, which my client Maddie likes to move very fast. So, I like to tell her to slow down and breathe, inhale on the way down, exhale on the way up, not just kind of going through the motion, but being mindful with the movement.
So time under tension is basically putting a time to the reps. So like you said,
Yes.
with that movement, it might be 8 reps within 30 seconds, but you want it to be 30, like you don't want it to necessarily, like quicker isn't always better, I guess, is the way of thinking about that. Am I correct on that?
Yes. And I would say, honestly, for most people, like if you're an athlete, quicker is maybe better for a certain time in your season. We're not even going to get into this, guys. But for like your average person, I mean, yeah, unless you're like a really good golfer or tennis player and you need some rotational power, we would do some things for that. But with most strength and hypertrophy movements, I don't want you just falling ass to grass in a squat and not allowing your muscles and tendons to feel the movement. Um, in my eyes, it's actually less beneficial. But, and from a physical therapy standpoint, you're whatever, we're not, maybe cut that part out. But like so many people at the gym I see move so fast. I don't really agree with it, but whatever.
No, I think that's helpful to know. And so then what about, this is like a very generic term, but you hear thrown around like tempo. So like time under tension versus tempo.
So tempo and time under tension are like siblings in my eyes. Like the tempo of a movement, like so time under tension, this can go with, I mean, other terms which we'll get into, but like eccentric and concentric. So like going down into a Bulgarian or a squat, that's the lowering portion. That's the eccentric part of the movement where you are actually kind of tearing your muscle apart, so to speak. So for me, a good bookmark is like hopefully it takes you about 3 seconds. So like 3, 2, 1, lowering into the movement. And that's also a tempo. And then like you don't have to rest at the bottom, but if you want to add a pause or like tempo reps, like a pause at the bottom, then you can. And then you can go 3 seconds on the way up again if you want to. 3, 2, 1. So in total, if you did pause at the bottom, that would be a 7-second movement.
Okay, cool. Very interesting. This is so helpful. And then you already threw out these terms, so we might as well talk about them. Concentric, you mentioned eccentric, but then there's concentric, and am I missing another one, or did you already describe
There's
that?
no isometric. Those three kind of go together. So within a movement, let's just talk about the squat. Everyone knows a squat. You squat onto your couch and toilet all day, every day. Um, well, some women maybe more than others, but so isometric, creating force without changing the muscle length. Think of doing a wall sit in all of those gym classes growing up and hating it. That is an isometric. Or I'll give one more example. Imagine doing a bicep curl, but you keep your elbow at 90 degrees. Like you're not curling up, you're just holding it at 90 degrees. That's an isometric, I guess I wouldn't even say movement because you're not moving, creating force without changing muscle length.
So
Um,
it's something where you're still.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And then eccentric is when you're like lowering into the movement. That's like you're dropping down from a pull up, you're sitting down into the squat, you're lowering the weight from a row, you're lowering to the floor in a push up. That's the eccentric, which I think is a super important part of the movement and is a part of the movement that people will kind of ignore. And then concentric is flexing, contracting the muscle fibers. So standing up from a squat, pulling up from a pull up, pushing up from a push up. It's the exact opposite of the eccentric movement.
Okay. Yeah, that's good to know. And since you're talking about these different types of movements, I know something very commonly I see in here is like push versus pulling. So you hear of different pushing movements and pulling movements and how you should combine them. And I feel like it's kind of self-explanatory, like push versus pull when we're talking about like a push up or a pull up, but give some other examples and talk a little bit more about like what push versus pull movements are.
Yes, good question. Which we will get into, like push day and pull day and whatever next time. So pushing movements, think of just what it sounds, pushing like away. So push-ups for upper body, chest press, shoulder press, and then for lower body, pushing movements are squats, split squats, step ups. Think you're like pushing the ground away. And then for upper body movements, you're pushing the weights away. Or if you're doing a push up, you're pushing the ground away. So that's pushing. And pulling movements for upper body are like pull ups, rows, lat pull down, those sort of movements where you're pulling the weight or like the bar for pull up towards you. You're pulling your body in pull ups towards the movement. Rows, you're pulling the weights towards you. And pulling movements for lower body is deadlifts. Think you're using your upper body to pull the weight off of the floor. So that includes single leg deadlifts, split stance deadlifts, all of that stuff. With that, you can also think of this with anterior and posterior push movements. You're using a lot of the front of your body. You're doing push-ups. Anterior is the front of your body, like your chest, your core, your quads. Whereas pulling movements is more posterior. You can remember those P's together. Is posterior chain, your backside. So deadlifts are using your hamstrings, glutes, back muscles. Pull-ups are using your back muscles, all that stuff. But with both, I want to say you should obviously still be using your core. And your core is more than just your abs, but we're not even going to get into that.
And you might have used this term, or maybe I'm just used to hearing this term around these different things, but like hinging and versus more knee dominant. Can you explain those two things?
Yes. And we'll, of course, as we're saying this, constantly get into this more next time because I kind of do most of my workouts based on like hinging and knee dominant, which can also go with push pull. But hinging is where your hip is going through a greater range of motion than your knee. Hinging is like deadlifting, and knee dominant movements is where your knee is moving in a bigger angle than your hip. So you're in more of like a split squat, squats, lunges, and things like that.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about what different parts of our body means, the movements of the different parts of our body. So let's talk about specifically the movements. So you've given some examples of push and pull and all of that type of stuff. But another term that or I guess terms I hear a lot thrown around are like single joint movements versus multi-joint movements. Wow, these are like tongue twisters. Versus compound movements. Can you give some examples of those?
Yes. And we'll go into this more next time. But like compound movements is usually, I'm just going to say now, what you're going to start your workout with. It's big movements, full body movements, squats, deadlifts, bench press. And then multi-joint movements are like shoulder press, where you're moving your shoulder and your elbow. So that's 2 joints. And then dumbbell rows, you're moving while your shoulder blade is gliding on your ribs. So you're moving your shoulder a little bit and your elbow a decent amount. So those are 2 examples of multi-joint movements. And single joint movements would be like standing and doing a bicep curl, where maybe no other joint will be moving, but just your elbow, and you're trying to keep your shoulder still to not use momentum. Or a rope tricep extension or skull crusher is literally just your elbow joint moving, which is more so like shower muscles, not like big strength muscles like the ones you'd be using in compound movements and multi joint movements.
And with these movements, I'm trying to think of like how to ask this question, but I guess an example I'll use is like in a group fitness class, since we had talked about that a little bit last time, a lot of times you'll hear cues or things being said about like what a movement should look like in terms of like form. But because everybody's body is different, are these movements, is it okay if like person to person, these movements look a little bit different because of our body structure? Can you talk about that with like joint movements, and maybe you'll get into this a little bit more, but like the form of things?
Yeah, especially like with compound movements like squats, it's so old school to have like your knees and feet facing perfectly forward, where not everybody's hip sockets are facing perfectly forward. So, like, I turn my feet out a little bit and my knees follow my toes with that, which is totally fine and hopefully helpful. Like, if you play around with your squat stance, you'll feel when it like feels good to do one thing and like you might feel restricted in another way. So those will totally look different, and it's okay for it to look different.
I think that's good to hear, because I think if people are working out on their own or they're not working out with a personal trainer, they might be following what someone else is doing, whether that be a group fitness instructor or like a video or like, I don't know, something like that, or just even what they hear and see, and they might feel like they're doing it wrong, and they might be, right? Like we might just be totally doing it wrong, but it's also good to hear, like, I think you said, I mean, if something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't right. Even if someone else is saying it's right, like maybe it's just not right for your
Yeah.
body.
Yeah. And I should say too, with even with that's more joint specific, but for me, I have like I'm 5'4", but my legs are as long as my mom's, and she's 5'7". I think she was 5'8" at one point. She's shrinking a little as gravity does to us. But my legs are as long as hers, and I have a short little torso. Um, and my femurs are long. I have long femurs. So like when I squat, I have great ankle mobility. My knees can come forward, but my chest will come down and forward a little bit more than I guess you can say it maybe should. But my squat is not wrong and it's still great. And it just looks a little different than if I were to be perfectly proportionate, and that's fine.
Yeah. And nobody is perfectly proportionate too. So it's always good to just another reason we should understand and learn about our bodies and how we're made and all of that. I think something that I've even taken away from this conversation is there's so much more than just doing the movement and understanding the movement in terms of like form, and even like you gave the good example of time under tension. So I know sometimes when I worked in a gym specifically, I wasn't a personal trainer, but like people would come into my office and talk about doing a training session, like if they were a new member, and just saying like, oh, I don't feel like I need a trainer. I just need a workout, kind of like the whole meal plan thing. Like I just need a meal plan and I'll follow
Mm-hmm.
it. And I think this is a great example because you might not be getting the most out of your workout if you aren't following some, I don't want to say like following some of these things to a T, but you know, I think it's just a sign to show the benefit of working with someone individually to help you learn more about this type of stuff, but then B, like the great example of if you're doing a movement too quickly or not in the right form for your body, you might just not be getting the most out of your workout.
Yeah, I totally agree.
So work with a personal trainer. No, I'm just kidding.
Oh my gosh, Chelsea.
So reach out to Sophie. Her number is. No, I'm just
312.
kidding.
So I just want to touch on supercompensation, which please Google it right now if you're listening to this and have the ability to do so. I use it to help me describe to clients like how many times a week they can/should work out. So say you are starting at base, which again, if you look up the graph, so you're starting at base, and then during the training session, you are breaking your musculature down. So now you're below your baseline. And the recovery, you're going back up to baseline and hopefully going slightly above that, which is called supercompensation, because your body is adapting to what you did. And then that's ideally when you want to work out again, because then you're a little bit higher than your baseline. You'll break down again, go below, come back up, and supercompensate and continue to build on that, which there can be the reverse where you are burning out and you'll actually keep after you break down after the workout and you don't recover enough so you don't reach your baseline and you work out again, you'll go below that line again and you'll continue to kind of break down. But I have to say that does not happen to your average person a lot at all. If anything, I would probably say people don't work out enough, probably. I would definitely say no less than twice a week, preferably 3, maybe even 4 times a week if you can. And that way you're going to adapt because, again, exercise, working out is all about adapting, training properly so you can get some muscular goals, maybe lose a little bit of fat if that's what you're, wanting to achieve. But yeah, Google supercompensation and check it out. And I have to say that I don't know exactly what your body needs exactly with that. Like I might be able to recover quicker than Chelsea, or Chelsea could recover quicker than me. So it all depends. And then with that, I do want to say we'll talk about DOMS, which is delayed onset of muscle soreness, in the next one. But yeah.
No, that's super helpful. And thank you for explaining all of that. I think it will be helpful for people to know the basic definitions. And if you already knew some of these basic definitions, it probably was a good reminder. I know it was for me. So thanks for tuning in.
Yes, thank you for listening.
Bye.
Bye.